All right. Let's take some questions on miracles before we get into the New Testament. Does anyone have any questions on miracles or anything we've covered to this point? Yes, sir. You mind coming up to the mic? You guys should not have eaten those sugar cookies. Everyone's going, how do we stay awake here? Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't have any sugar cookies.
No, you did. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Steve.
Yes, Steve. Go ahead.
Just to bring this up, you probably have put this in one of your books or something, which I haven't read. So the question, what do you do with the end of Mark?
Oh, yeah, the end of Mark. Good question.
Because that goes into the other question that was about earlier. Well, if that's not really in there, then how do you believe the rest of it?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The end of Mark, if you go from Mark chapter 16, verse 9 to verse 20, it's not in the earliest manuscripts. And so some scholars, in fact, if you have a Bible right now, you can probably look in there. There'll probably be a footnote that'll say something like these verses, not in the earliest manuscripts. And so the question is, were these added later by an editor? Or is it just the fact that maybe an early manuscript got it wrong and the later manuscript had it right? Or, there's a whole bunch of different theories here. Even if the end of Mark wasn't in the original text, there's nothing taught in Mark that isn't taught elsewhere except snake handling. So that's why I don't do it. It talks about that snakes will not hurt them, that kind of thing. There are some people, as you know, who, particularly some places in the South, they'll have worship services and they're handling snakes. I think that's crazy. In any event, even if all of that isn't in the Bible, or isn't in Mark, I should say, everything that's in there is taught elsewhere. So I don't think it creates a problem for us theologically. In other words, we're not losing any new truth from not having Mark 16, 9 to 20 in there, because what's taught there is taught elsewhere. So that's one of the few places in the Bible, that the New Testament, where we're not sure if that should be in there. Interestingly, there's another story that is under question, and guess which one that is? Jesus and the woman caught in adultery. There's a question as to whether that should have been in the original or was in the original. It sounds like it's a Jesus story, though, doesn't it? I mean, it does sound like that would be him. So it's not some wild story that is incongruent with everything else we know about Jesus. Neither is the end of Mark incongruent with what we know about the resurrection and what happened afterwards. So whether or not the end of Mark is in there, it's an interesting theological question, but I don't think it affects us either way. Yeah. The basic thing is it says you will be able to do all these things. You will be able to do what? Well, but who's he talking to at that point? Is he talking to everybody? Is he talking to the immediate disciples? That's the question, right? You see, everything in the Bible is not prescriptive for everybody throughout time. Everything in the Bible, some of it's prescriptive, but some of it's descriptive. And sometimes it's hard to figure out, are we reading a description here or a prescription here? I know I'm going to frustrate a lot of you here, but I have to do this. Those who believe. Who's he talking to? Is he talking to everybody of all time, or is he talking about the immediate disciples?
Then you have to say, what about the Great Commission?
Mm-hmm. And does he mean at all times those who believe are going to be able to do these things?
No, I don't have an insight in that.
Yeah, I know. That's the question. So
it could be either one.
It could be. That's why I don't put a lot of stock in Mark 16, 9 to 20. And that's why there's a note in your book there. Yeah. So, but it is taught elsewhere that faith can help you, obviously, with miracles in certain instances, as he says in Mark 11, if you go back a few chapters. So the question is, how much new information are we getting in Mark 16, or Mark 16, 9 to 20? And I don't know if we're getting all that much new. But as you're right, it is disputed, so I don't know if I would say that should be in there. But for example, we yank things out of context all the time. In fact, some of you are going to hate me for this, but I have to tell you, Jeremiah 29 does not apply to you. Okay, Jeremiah 29:11, people always quote it. They quote Jeremiah 29, oh, the plans I have for you, right? And they think, oh, God's going to make me prosperous and all. If you look at the context of that, who's he writing to? He's writing to the exiles in Babylon, And he says 70 years from now, you're going to prosper. Okay, you want to take that as a promise to you? Why don't you just take that? 70 years from now, you're going to prosper. Well, thanks a lot. Why do we quote Jeremiah 29:11 and we don't quote Jeremiah 44:11? Because what does Jeremiah 44:11 says? God says to the exiles in Egypt, I'm going to judge you and destroy you. You see, we selectively quote what we want because we think, oh, that's nice. He has a future for me. Let me quote Jeremiah 29:11. But I'll ignore Jeremiah 44:11 because I don't like that. People invariably base their beliefs not on the truth, but what they find attractive, right? So the Bible is it's not like a spiritual horoscope. You don't just open it and go, oh, this applies to me now. No, you've got to see the context. Like Steve's trying to do. Does this apply to us now or not apply to us now? Should this even be in here? That's the way you're supposed to look at the Bible. So make sure you try and figure out who's it written to and who the promises are for. Yes, ma'am.
Hello.
What's your name?
Denise.
Hey, Denise.
Hey, just a quick question. Are there miracles nowadays? Like, is there any evidence and proof? And I guess who decides what's a miracle, what's not? Are miracles like kind of left in the Old Testament or New Testament?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And in fact, there's two groups out there. One group is a cessationist group, and another, they think miracles don't occur now, and another group believes they do. I lean toward the fact that they do, not because I've seen one personally, but there's too much evidence that they do occur. And probably the best set of books written recently on this are two hernia-inducing books by Craig Keener called Miracles, Volume 1 and 2. This guy is an unbelievable scholar who has investigated miracles not only in the past but to the present day, and has some great documentation that miracles have occurred. And he's a professor at Asbury University in, I think it's Kentucky, if I'm not mistaken. And he's a brilliant guy. Anyways, 2 volumes, if you're interested, Miracles by Craig Keener, K-E-E-N-E-R. But I think there is a distinction to be made here. Denise, right? The distinction to be made is between the fact of miracles and the gift of miracles. In other words, I think the fact of miracles, that miracles can occur whenever God wants them to occur, is true. But whether or not there's people out there who have the gift of miracles, like the gift of healing, like Paul had or Peter had, I don't think that occurs today. Because those people were prophets or apostles who were given that gift so people would obey what they said, and they would take what they wrote in the Bible as true. But since we're not adding any pages to our Bible now, I don't think there's any apostles out there in that sense where these people have the ability to do miracles. In fact, there's a point where it appears that Paul and Peter lose their ability to do miracles. I mean, Paul's even saying, pray for so-and-so. He's sick. Pray. Well, Paul, if you could heal people, why were you praying? Well, just go heal them, right? So there was a period that Paul and Peter and the others had this ability to do miracles so people would know that these people spoke for God, but then it appears they lost that. I mean, there are people out there, and there were evangelists years ago. In fact, Oral Roberts was one of them, who was claiming that he had the ability to do miracles. And he went up in his prayer tower and said, God told me I need $8 million to build a hospital. If you can heal people, you don't build hospitals, you empty them. Right? Why is he claiming the ability to do miracles and claiming he also needs a hospital? That doesn't mean everything Oral Roberts did was wrong. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that I don't think people today have the gift of miracles. God can do a miracle whenever he wants.
Does that happen? Does anybody claim that that's happened?
I think it has happened, and Craig Keener has some of the evidence in his books, but I don't see that there are people out there who have the ability to do it on command, like Paul and Peter and those other folks. Yes, Eric.
Yeah, so it seems to me that a certain amount of this, going back to some of the stuff we discussed earlier, the big miracles, like how did the Big Bang happen? How did Jesus rise from the dead? Kind of hinge on whether you believe that there is a supernatural explanation for miracles versus a natural explanation, right? So it seems to me that belief in miracles is is pretty central to a lot of this.
Well, think about from the beginning of the universe. If there was no nature, nature couldn't have created the universe. It must be something beyond nature,
Right.
something supernatural.
Right.
So from the first miracle, we have the possibility of other miracles, because if there is a being that transcends the natural world, then that being can also intervene in the natural world.
So if you're a materialist and you believe that there's a scientific or rational or natural explanation for all miracles, then it would seem that all bets are off. Right? That if the naturalist would claim that there is no scientific, or that there's a scientific explanation for every miracle.
Well, there's a difference between raising a possibility and having evidence for that possibility. I mean, you could say anything you want, right? You can say green leprechauns appear, but you can't see them, and they do these things. I mean, you can come up with any explanation you want, but that's not the same as having evidence for that explanation. So there's a difference between coming up with a possibility and coming up with evidence for that possibility. And what the naturalists can't do is come up with evidence for their possibility.
Well, so one example of raising people from the dead, which is a legit miracle, the naturalists could point to situations where you had someone who was declared clinically dead, for 30 minutes, and then was found then to be alive.
Right,
again.
right.
And say, well, there's your scientific explanation for.
That could be a scientific explanation for a given supposed miracle where a guy was dead for 30 minutes or thought he was dead, but he really wasn't. But that wouldn't explain the resurrection of Jesus, because the resurrection of Jesus took place over 3 days, or at least 48 hours, a little bit more than 48 hours.
Sure.
And the fact that it was predicted, and Jesus certainly was dead when the spear went in his side and blood and water came out. Even the journal, the American Medical Association, verified the evidence, said, yeah, he was dead. There's no way he could have swooned, as they say.
Right.
So, yeah, while you could find parallels that may have a natural explanation, when you try and apply that to the miracle of Jesus, it doesn't work.
Sure, I totally agree.
Okay. All right, thanks, Eric. Yes, Fern, just say it loud. I'll repeat.
I'd like to know how much of the Bible, both the Old and the New Testament, have got mythology.
How much of the Bible, the question is, how much of the Bible has mythology in it?
Yes, and do you believe that there is any mythology in the Bible?
Depends on what you mean by mythology.
Well, stories
That didn't occur? Well, there are parables that maybe didn't occur. They're just moral stories. But I think if you look at the Old Testament, in particular, when it says that, say, Moses parted the Red Sea, I think the Red Sea was really parted. When it says that, yes, because if God can create the universe, he can certainly part the Red Sea.
Well, I know my ex-husband is a meteorologist.
Uh-huh.
Now, he had told me it could have never happened.
All right, her ex-husband said it couldn't happen because he's a meteorologist.
He did work for Noah 38 years. So.
Okay. Well, why couldn't the God who created the weather patterns intervene in them and part the Red Sea? In fact, it even says in the Bible how God did that one. He said he caused a strong east wind to come up. A strong east wind. If God wanted to create a strong east wind, he's using now a natural force to do a supernatural thing. Could he do that?
Sure.
Why not?
Find out.
Yeah. I mean, Cecil B. DeMille did it with Jell-O and a blow dryer, and it looked real to me. All right. Yes. All right, Kevin.
Okay, so with the whole parting of the Red Sea, the logical issue that you have here is the multiple texts that talk about the parting of the Red Sea. For example, in Exodus, it's talking about the Red Sea as, like that you see from what's the movie?
Ten Commandments.
Yeah, Ten Commandments, with the whoosh and all that sort of thing. But if you look at the text and if you look at the Hebrew in Deuteronomy and in other parts of the Old Testament, of the Torah, it talks about it almost like that it receded, and it almost makes it almost like that the waters just went down in kind of like a marshland. So naturally, conceivably, you can have the Jewish people walking across the Red Sea because of natural occurrences between the tides and stuff like that, and the chariots getting caught and all that sort of stuff. So the question is here, with the multiple versions of the same story that you do see in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament with rhetoric and stories being stated again and again and again, it's which one you believe in, because if you believe in one of the types of the stories, where if you look and basically break down the Hebrew, yes, it talks about, with the Red Sea going whoosh and all that beautiful, cool stuff. But then if you read other ones and how the Hebrew is and how the structure is and what words they're using, then it's almost like that it receded into like a marshland. Now, it's still pretty darn cool that it actually naturally happened, that at that time period when Moses really needed it to run across, but then it gets back to your word of what is a miracle and what is a divine.
It doesn't seem to me that those are contradictory. I'd have to read both accounts, but the problem here is if you're going to say it just receded, what you're going to have to say is that the entire Egyptian army drowned in a marsh, which doesn't seem to me. It seems like the Cecil B. DeMille version, or as you're saying, the Exodus version, makes more sense. The water's up high, and if they went across the Gulf of Aqaba, which is probably where they went across into Saudi Arabia, that's a pretty deep sea there, or the pretty deep Gulf. So when they went through, there's a lot of water on each side of them. And then when they got through, God closed it up on the Egyptians. If it's just a marshy kind of thing, like the Reed Sea, so to speak, you could explain that they could get through. But how could the Egyptians have been drowned in that? That wouldn't make any sense.
Because you get highs and low tides, and
right, but it wasn't a tide. It wasn't a tide thing that took several hours.
Well, I mean, think of an army moving across, especially at chariots. I mean, we think of chariots as, they're running fast and that sort of thing. Think of the logistics of an army moving. It takes a long time in operations for even just a small troop to walk across. I mean, that's why one of the reasons, going back to the Revolutionary War, why the fighting in the South for the British were so tough is because they were banding these big armies together going through swamplands. That's very difficult and very slow going.
Well, I'd have to look at the accounts. I don't have them memorized, but just remember that just because you have two different accounts doesn't mean that the main event that the accounts talk about didn't occur. For example, let me give you one from modern history. Do you know that when the Titanic went down, one group of survivors said it went down whole. Another group of survivors said it broke in two.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess we can't believe the Titanic sank then, right?
No, we can believe it sank, but how you interpret it can have drastic responses and changeover.
But the point here is, just because you have eyewitnesses coming to different conclusions about details doesn't mean that the main event didn't occur. And so what we're talking about here, was there a parting of the Red Sea? Yes, there was, in both accounts, both Exodus and Deuteronomy. If there was an editor in Deuteronomy that said it his own way other than Moses, that could be the case too. But it doesn't seem to create these problems where you're saying, well, there's an error in the Bible. No, there's just different ways of looking at things, just like there are different ways of looking how the Titanic went down.
But then you can make that same argument looking at subjective truth and objective truth. If
There are
subjectivity
There are
in the
no
Bible,
subjective truths. All truth is objective.
Right. So if, under your understanding of what you just stated, if there is embellishments or different that is not quote-unquote true 100%, then that means that other things in the Bible could possibly be not as we fully interpret it today.
Well, let's say, for the sake of argument, that's the case. Let's say there are things in the Bible that in the details may be an error. I don't believe that, but let's just say that's true. The big question I ask skeptics is this: so, what does that prove?
What do you mean?
What's the implications of that?
It can change the moral bearing. It can change the direction on what we say about what God has decreed and what God has not decreed.
On peripheral issues, yes. But does that mean, if you find an error in a newspaper, does that mean everything in the newspaper is false?
But that's why it's a primary source that has possible bias in it.
There could be bias in it. But again, does that bias necessarily mean that everything and the central arguments or the central historical facts that are put forth in that text, does that mean that they're false?
It means on what you're looking at within that text.
Right. So that's the question. I think that if there are minor details that are in error in the Bible, Jesus still has risen from the dead.
Oh yeah, no.
And
like I said, I'm a Christian. I do
still
believe,
true.
but I'm just looking at these in those points and breakdown. I could definitely see how people could say, well, boom, well, boom.
They can do that all day. It won't affect that Christianity is true. Jesus is still risen from the dead, regardless if Mary got to the tomb first or Mary and Joanna got to the tomb first, right?
Right.
Okay, good.
Yeah, very good.
All right, thanks. All right. How are you guys doing? Do we need to take a short break or should we go to the end? It's 10 after 2. Go ahead, Doug.
I believe that Dr. Seeger
Uh-huh.
and Tim Ripley will testify that I probably should be dead, but I'm not. And I think the reason I'm not is because of the prayers of the saints. And my brain surgeon actually called me his miracle. And I think we have to believe in miracles, and we have to take our prayers to the Lord.
Absolutely.
So we can't just dismiss the question, are miracles possible? We have to believe with our whole hearts, I think.
Well, I think not only are they possible, they've occurred. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. I'm just taking the skeptical criticism here. When they say that miracles can occur, I think, first of all, that's illogical. The greatest miracle of all has already occurred, right? The second question is, have any other miracles occurred since then? And that's why we're looking at history, or we're about to look at history to see if that's the case. Are we good? Can we keep going for another 20 minutes and then go to questions? All right, let's just keep moving then. We know that truth exists. It's self-defeating to say it doesn't. Does God exist? Well, we've got those three arguments that shows that he does. Are miracles possible? The greatest miracle has already occurred. The question we have to ask now is, have any other miracles occurred since the first miracle? And for that, we've got to look at, is the New Testament reliable? Is it true in the basics of what it says? And there are two questions you need to ask in order to develop this point. And the first is, do we have an accurate copy of the original New Testament documents? And the second is, do the original New Testament documents tell the truth? The answer to question number one is yes. We already quoted Bart Ehrman on this inadvertently when Kevin asked the question about, even Bart Ehrman agrees we know what the New Testament originally said. That's point one. So we're not going to spend any time on that. If you want to get into it, look in chapter 9 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. But now we're going to look at the New Testament writers tell the truth, and there's a lot of good evidence for that. And the evidence I like to present all begin with the letter E. This will help you remember them. They all begin with the letter E. We're not going to go through all this today. We'll do a couple of these today. We'll do a couple tomorrow in the service at 10 o'clock. But I'll just list them now. First of all, we have early testimony. Number two, we have eyewitness testimony. Number three, we have embarrassing testimony. We'll get to that tomorrow, actually. Number four, we have excruciating testimony. That deals with the fact that these people died for it. We'll get to that tomorrow as well. Number five, we have expected testimony. That deals with Old Testament prophecy. Number six, we have extra-biblical testimony. This is evidence outside the New Testament documents. In other words, these are writers outside the New Testament documents, which give us some insight as to what happened to Jesus and the apostles. And actually, the book has the top 10 reasons we know the New Testament writers told the truth. Here are just 6 of them. And we're only going to spend a little bit of time on a couple of them today, all right? So let's just start right here at early testimony. How do we know that these documents were written down early? Because if they're written down early, it increases the likelihood that they're telling the truth, all right? And we got to go back into the first century. And there are two events in the first century that, whether you're a Christian or an atheist or anywhere in between, you believe. And that is the cross, or Jesus was crucified sometime between, say, 30, 33 AD, somewhere in here. And the temple in the city of Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans, okay? Everybody agrees with this historically. There's hardly any historical doubt on this at all. Even Bart Ehrman, again, the atheist, agnostic, biblical scholar from Chapel Hill, says it's proven that Jesus has been had been crucified. There's no doubt about that, okay? In fact, here's a point that we need to revisit. It's not that the data is in question, it's how you interpret the data. In other words, Gary Habermas, who teaches at Liberty University, great scholar, had him on the radio this past month a couple of times, great guy. He's developed what's called the minimal facts approach to the resurrection. And what he says is there are minimal facts that even atheist scholars believe. More than 90% of scholars believe that Jesus was crucified and that his disciples believed Jesus had risen from the dead and that Paul was converted and that James, his brother, was converted. They all believe this based on the evidence. What they disagree with is how do we interpret this evidence? Jesus was crucified. His disciples believed he rose from the dead. Paul, James were converted. Oh, and also the disciples were willing to die for their belief. They all believe in those minimal facts. The question is, how do you interpret those minimal facts? What best explains the data? And it seems to me the best explanation is the resurrection. But if you're philosophically going to rule out intelligent causes before you look at the evidence, it doesn't matter how much the evidence points towards intelligence, right? You're going to say, no, it wasn't intelligence. So they all agree this. They agree there was a crucifixion. They agree there was a temple. Now let's go backwards in that first century, that 40 years or so in that first century. We know that Paul is killed sometime in the mid to late 60s. At the hands of Nero. We have good evidence for that. Same thing is true with Peter, by the way. We know that James, the half-brother of Jesus, is killed as a martyr in the city of Jerusalem. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, throw him off the Temple Mount, and then they stone him to death. He's the pastor of the church in Jerusalem, and they kill him. Why? Well, I don't think they liked him preaching Jesus right in their territory there. How do we know this, by the way? How do we know James dies as a martyr? No New Testament document tells us this. You know who tells us this? Josephus, the Jewish historian who lived from 37 AD to about 100 AD and was probably in Jerusalem at the time. He tells us this, as does Hegesippus, another writer who lived later. So James is dead in 62 AD. We know Acts is written by about 62 AD. Why? How does Acts end? Paul's in prison where? In Rome. Just ends abruptly. Who are the main characters in Acts? Peter, Paul, no Mary, just Peter and Paul. And then there are two executions or two martyrs in the book of Acts. Who are they? Stephen and James, the brother of John. Not this James, but James, the brother of John, in Acts chapter 12. There's no mention of the execution of Peter or Paul, the two main characters in the book. What's that telling you? They're not quite dead yet, right? They're still alive. There's other reasons to believe Acts is written by 62. Part of the reasons is there's no mention of the Jewish war or the uprising or any of this. These are things that are too big to leave out, in other words. We know that 1 Corinthians, even Bart Ehrman agrees 1 Corinthians is written by about 55 AD. And here's the most important point. The creed in 1 Corinthians 15 goes all the way back to the event itself. What do you mean by creed? In 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8, there's an ancient creed. In fact, I'm going to read it. If you have a Bible, by the way, this is a Bible. You guys know what a Bible is? See, most apologists don't have Bibles, okay? They just defend the faith, but they never read it. So 1 Corinthians 15 is probably the premier chapter on the resurrection in the entire Bible, and the earliest evidence for the resurrection in the entire Bible is right here, 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8. Why do I say earliest? Because although the creed was written down here, it actually originated here. In other words, this was oral testimony that was the eyewitnesses knew, and Paul ultimately wrote it down here, but this, even atheists agreed, this goes back to the event itself, within months of the event. And as I read these few verses, I want you to listen to how many times you hear the word that. Are you ready? Because there's a rhythm to this. Even in English it comes out. For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me also, as one is abnormally born. How many times you hear the word that? 5 times. There's a rhythm to it. This was memorized. Notice all of these people here are people who are witnesses of the resurrection. One of them is James. So James dies as a martyr 30 years later for his own brother. We'll talk about the implications of that tomorrow. But that creed is the earliest evidence we have for the resurrection. It's impossible that this is mythology at this point, because these people are living witnesses. They know what's going on. Now, if Acts is written by 62, Luke has got to be prior to that, right? Because Luke is written before Acts. How do we know? Because in Luke he says, "Oh, excellent Theophilus, I put all this together for you." And then in Acts he says, "In my former work, oh, excellent Theophilus," whoever Theophilus was, some kind of Roman official. So Luke is prior to Acts, and Mark is probably prior to Luke, as most scholars believe Mark is the first gospel, may or may not be. So you've got the Gospels written prior to 60 AD, at least 2 of them. Matthew may be earlier as well. And I know this, I may be going out on a limb here, but I'd have to say Paul wrote all of his works before he died. I mean, is that fair? You think Paul wrote all his stuff before he died? Yeah, absolutely. Here's the undisputed works of Paul: 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Romans, Galatians. I know there's more, but that's all you need to know to show that there was a resurrection. And then most, if not all, the New Testament documents written prior to 70 AD. How do we know that? The destruction of the temple and the city, there's no mention of it. Actually, it is mentioned one place. Where is it mentioned? Jesus actually predicts it. When he's sitting on the Mount of Olives looking down at the temple, and if you come to Israel with us, you'll be there. You look down at the temple, where the temple was, and Jesus said, "Not one stone will be left upon another." And they said, "When are these things going to occur?" And he said, "These will occur before this generation passes away." When did he say that? He said that in 30 AD. What's a generation? 40 years. When did it happen? 70 AD. In other words, Jesus predicts it, but then nobody comes around later and says, "Look, Jesus was right." Why not? Because they'd already written the New Testament documents by then. Maybe John is written late. Maybe Revelation is written late. I actually think John is early. Why? Because he actually says in John chapter 5 that there is a sheep gate, and he talks about the temple still standing in John chapter 5. And there was no gate or temple standing after 70 AD. In fact, if you go to Jerusalem today, there's a sheep gate on the east side of the city. And when you walk in the sheep gate, if you walk down about 50 feet, you see St. Anne's Church on the right, and right behind St. Anne's Church is the Pool of Bethesda, the remains of it. And none of that was there after the temple was destroyed. But John makes it seem like it was all there when he's writing the book. Not the church, church wasn't there, but. So this is early stuff, and this is during the age of the eyewitnesses. Why is that important? Because it's very difficult for legend to creep into a story while the eyewitnesses are still there walking around. In fact, it's only now you start to have people saying the Holocaust never occurred. It's just starting. Why? Well, the eyewitnesses are dying off. We even have videotape, and you have people saying it never happened. This happens we're within 40 years of the whole thing. It's all done. The Holocaust happened, 70 years ago? More than 70 years ago now. So it takes at least 2 generations after the events for myth to really crowd out historical fact if it's going to. This is early stuff. And much of what you read in the New Testament documents is earlier than when it was written. Like the Creed is 30 AD or 33 AD, but it was written down in 55 AD. In fact, Gary Habermas has identified 41 creeds in the New Testament that all predate when it was written down. Because people memorized things orally, and they were eyewitnesses to it, so they could remember it. And then when it was written down, they put their thoughts on paper. But any one of us in here, those of us who are old enough, we can remember things from 20, 30 years ago. Especially if they were impact events, which we'll talk about tomorrow. Dramatic events that would have been impressed on your memory. We'll see that tomorrow if you come back tomorrow. All right, let's take one more, and then we'll take questions. Eyewitness testimony. How do we know we have eyewitness testimony? Well, these gentlemen claim to be eyewitnesses. Yeah, I know. But they actually proved to be eyewitnesses. Why? Because they put historical crosshairs in the text. Check this out. This is from Luke chapter 3. I'm just going to read a couple of verses. And as I read these verses, ask yourself, does it sound like Luke is making up a story? Here we go. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Licinius, tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the desert. Does it sound like he's making up a story here? No, in fact, an exact date is given. What's the date? 29 AD. How do we know? 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, who came to power in 14 AD. So he's telling you when this was. It would be like if somebody says it's the 8th year of the Obama administration. Joe Biden is the vice president. Paul Ryan is the leader of the House. Mitch McConnell is the leader of the Senate. John Kerry is the Secretary of State. You'd know exactly when we were talking about, right? That's what they're doing here. It's the same kind of thing. In fact, all 8 people are known from history. They all lived at this exact time, so this is not a once upon a time story. It's not a myth. If Luke were trying to pass off a lie as the truth, he wouldn't do it this way. You could check this out, couldn't you? And as you know, this is how they dated things back then, by reigns. The 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. By the way, no extra charge for this. You guys remember the Mary Tyler Moore Show? Yeah. Joe Biden is Ted Knight. Right? Huh? Can't you just see him with his white collar looking in the mirror going, "You handsome devil." Anyway. You'll remember that, won't you? All right. Also, notice that in the book of Acts, there are 84 confirmed historical eyewitness details. These are all listed in chapter 10 of the book. The Roman historian Colin Hemmer went through Acts with a fine-tooth comb, and he picked out all of the details in the book of Acts just from chapter 13 to chapter 28, and he found 84 of them that could be confirmed as eyewitness details. Like, for example, Luke has names of small towns in the Mediterranean right. He even has what would be the equivalent of the mayor of the town in these cities right. He even has the slang used there correctly. He has wind directions and water depths right when they ran aground on Malta, like I mentioned earlier. He even has all that right today. Now, while he is recording all these trivial details about mayors and wind directions and water depths and slang, Luke is also saying that Paul is doing miracles. Now, why would Luke tell the truth about these trivial details and lie about miracles? It doesn't seem to make any sense, right? In fact, William Ramsey, who was a top archaeologist, one of the early archaeologists, thought that Acts wasn't true and that Luke was not a good historian. By the way, this is a picture. If you've ever been to Corinth, this is what Corinth looks like today. My favorite spot on the Footsteps of Paul trip, because when you're in Corinth, you're standing right where Paul stood. There's no city built on it. This is ancient Corinth. In any event, this archaeologist, great archaeologist, after studying in the Mediterranean, realized Luke was right. He said this: I began with a mind unfavorable to it, Acts, but more recently I found myself brought into contact with the book of Acts as an authority for the topography, antiquities, and society of Asia Minor. It was gradually borne in upon me that in various details the narrative showed marvelous truth. In fact, here's what he found in all of his studies. He spent 20 years and he found out that Luke references 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 islands with no mistakes. He didn't have Google Earth. He was there. I mean, how else are you going to know this stuff? And if you notice in Luke chapter 16, Acts chapter 16, I should say, Luke changes the narrative from they did this and they did that to we did this and we did that. In other words, he joins Paul on one of his journeys, and then he's an eyewitness the rest of the way. Also, A.N. Sherwin-White, another historian, put it this way: for Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity must now appear absurd. Roman historians have long taken it for granted. This guy's not even a Christian. He's just saying, look, Luke's telling the truth here. And then Luke includes several other details that are accurate in his gospel. Some of them we just read in Luke chapter 3. And then John, the Gospel of John, has 59 historically confirmed or historically probable eyewitness details in it. They're all listed in chapter 10 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. So you say John's written in 90? Well, maybe it is, but he was an eyewitness because he's got all these details in there that only an eyewitness would know. And then the New Testament documents cite more than 30 people confirmed by secular sources or archaeology. You know, one of the things Dr. Geisler and I did when we wrote this book is we went through the New Testament. We said, you know, there's a lot of people in the New Testament like this. We see these names, and we're wondering, do these people really exist outside the New Testament documents? And all these names do. In other words, the Bible mentions all these, the New Testament documents do, but so do other sources, like Josephus, like archaeology, like other writers of the time. They mention all these people, the Agrippas, Bernice, Claudius, Felix, Caiaphas. Look at all the Herods. The New Testament gets all the Herods right. Imagine keeping that bloodline straight. James is mentioned by Josephus. I already mentioned that. So is Jesus, by the way. I don't have him in this list, but Jesus is mentioned by 10 ancient sources within 150 years of his life. They're all listed in chapter 10 of I Don't Have Enough, or chapter 9, actually, of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Pilate is listed. In fact, how do we know Pilate existed? Not only is he mentioned by Josephus, we actually have a archaeological find from Caesarea. This is the coastal town on the Mediterranean in Israel. This actually was discovered in 1961. It was the Roman headquarters while they occupied Israel. And this archaeology discovered, said in 61, said Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. Not only do we know that Caiaphas existed, we have his bones. Who was Caiaphas? Anyone? He was the high priest who did what? Sentenced Jesus to die. He was the one that asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus said, I am, and you will see the Son of Man coming with great power on the clouds. And immediately Caiaphas tore his robes and said, blasphemy. That guy, we actually have his bones. How do we know? This is an ossuary. This is what the Jews used between about 20 BC and 70 AD. After somebody died, about a year later, they'd exhume the remains and put the bones in this limestone box known as an ossuary. And this one was discovered in 1990. It was very ornate. And on the side of it, they found an inscription which identified the remains as the remains of Caiaphas, the very man who sentenced Jesus to die. Inside this box were the bones of a 60-year-old man and his family. Now, if you go to Israel today and you go to the Israel Museum, which is right across from the Knesset there in Jerusalem, you'll go in there and you'll see this thing sitting on a table, the real one, just sitting right there. Now, if you touch it, you'll probably be shot, but there it is. There are so many archaeological discoveries right there in Israel. In fact, if you look right above it, you'll see this. This is an actual heel bone of a crucified victim found in Jerusalem. There's the actual heel bone and the nail going through it. This is just a mock-up to show you the relative angle of the nail going through the heel bone. So not only do we know that crucifixion occurred, we have remains of a crucified victim found in Jerusalem. By the way, with regard to this ossuary, you may have heard there have been other ossuaries that have been discovered. And one person said, you may have heard of the Jesus ossuary. Have you heard of the Jesus ossuary? About 10 years ago, there was a documentary on the Discovery Channel about the Jesus ossuary. Now, if there is a Jesus ossuary, what does that mean? Yeah, Christianity's false because we have his bones, right? That's one way you could falsify Christianity is find the bones of Jesus. Okay? It's a falsifiable worldview, so to speak. But why did they think that it was the bones of Jesus? Well, actually, they didn't. There was just one guy or two guys that thought it might have been the bones of Jesus. You know the one guy? Who? Huh? Well, because it said Jesus on the side. Of course it doesn't, Fern. You're absolutely right. Why? Why doesn't it mean anything?
Because anyone could have written that.
Well, and because there's a lot of Jesuses back then. Yes, very common name. The sixth most common name in Palestine at the time. In fact, you know how many Jesus ossuaries they've discovered? This is as of about 10 years ago. 22. 22. So to say that any one of them is Jesus of Nazareth is like going out to the graveyard here and seeing John on the tombstone and going, it's got to be John the Baptist. No, not necessarily. In fact, the guy who sensationalized it, his name is James Cameron. Anyone hear that name before? Who's James Cameron? Director of Terminator, Titanic, and Avatar. He's a movie maker. He saw an opportunity to make some money, so he did this sensationalistic thing about the Jesus ossuary. The archaeologists who discovered it said it has nothing to do with Jesus of Nazareth, but that didn't stop Cameron. Of course, the Discovery Channel. Did we find the bones of Jesus? Of course. The New York Times. Oh, we found the bones of Jesus. Every time I read the New York Times and the Bible just to see what both sides are doing. I don't know about you, but it's biased. Speaking of bias. So no, the only Caiaphas ever found in history is what you see right here. There's no other Caiaphas known found in Jerusalem. In fact, archaeology actually corroborates the history of the Bible. Here's from U.S. News and World Report, not a Christian mouthpiece. In extraordinary ways, modern archaeology has affirmed the historical core of the Old and New Testaments, corroborating key points of the stories of Israel's patriarchs, the Exodus, the Davidic monarchy, and the life and times of Jesus. Hey, let's take another look at that. Let's see. That would be, an Old and New corroborating the patriarchs of Abraham, Moses, David, and that's the whole Bible. Yeah, that's the point. In fact, there are literally scores of these discoveries. They don't prove everything in the Bible is true, don't get me wrong, but they corroborate, yeah, this historical event really occurred. Now, don't let this get out of the room because it's politically incorrect, but did you know that archaeologists actually used the Bible to find stuff? I know that's hard to believe, but yeah, they do. So, there's a lot of evidence out there, and if you're interested, you can go a lot deeper into that. Now, tomorrow, we're going to get into embarrassing and excruciating testimony, but I want to go to questions now before 3 o'clock. So if anyone has any questions on anything we've covered here today, then let's do it. Matthew's coming around. Anyone want to beat Matthew to the microphone? Fern has something. Go ahead, Fern.
I want to mention, we were speaking about, Nazism, and the truth, was there really?
Here you go.
Holocaust?
Take that.
Well, I grew up in Forest Hills, Queens, New York, where at that time most of us were all, Jews. I was a little girl. And indeed, I saw people walking, on the streets with, say, numbers on their arms.
Really?
So now I can remember that with very, very pure accuracy, because a lot of Jews ended up in that area.
Huh.
So I just thought,
you're
I
a,
know.
you are a living eyewitness
Yes,
to
I
an
am.
aspect of the Holocaust.
Yes, I am.
Yes. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Matthew.
So my question kind of goes back to this morning when you introduced the whole topic of is the New Testament reliable? And you mentioned, so I really enjoyed this section because you covered a lot of really interesting stuff. It's always been something I've been interested in is the textual actually of the New Testament and the Bible in general. So it was nice to hear it again. But you talked about this morning, just briefly, you said, why don't we talk about the Old Testament? You said because the New Testament is true. It basically verifies the Old Testament. So my question, I guess, is why would you argue that the New Testament verifies the Old Testament, not the other way around? Because when I read through the New Testament, it seems that the New Testament verifies the Old Testament. I mean, like the first passage that came to my mind was Matthew 11, when John the Baptist is in prison and he sends his disciples to Jesus and he says, go ask them, are you the one to come or should we expect someone else? And Jesus says, go report to John what you hear and see. The blind see, the lame walk, those with skin diseases are healed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor are told the good news. So Jesus calling back the Old Testament.
Yeah, he's quoting Isaiah 61.
Exactly. And like the book of Matthew's entire purpose in writing that was to prove that Jesus and his ministry was validated by the Old Testament.
Exactly.
So why go that direction that you did instead of the opposite direction? I'm just kind of curious.
Well, actually, you could do it either way if you wanted to, but if the New Testament's reliable, then the Old Testament is affirmed because in the New Testament you have the authority figure Jesus, who is God, and whatever God teaches is true. And if Jesus teaches that the Old Testament is true, and he does, then it is. As Andy Stanley has mentioned before, as we have in the book, he'll say, look, my biology teacher told me that parts of Genesis are false, but since my biology teacher didn't rise from the dead, I'm going to believe in Jesus instead.
Right.
So you can argue both ways. In fact, Walt Kaiser, who's probably the top living Old Testament scholar, would argue that the Old Testament documents are reliable regardless of what the New Testament says about them, which they are. But in terms of a method to try and show people that the Old Testament is true, for me, the easiest way of doing it, it's just a matter of ease and time, is to show the New Testament's reliable. If it is, the Jesus character has the authority to tell us what's true in the past.
Right, which makes sense. So do you think, though, that, and just I'd like to get your input as far as since you do this for a living, so do you find that it's better to only go one direction? So discuss how the New Testament proves the Old Testament, or that the Old Testament proves the New Testament, and not to go both directions, because some people might accuse you of going, just circular reasoning.
No, I think that it depends on where somebody is. Like, for example, if you're talking to somebody who's not a believer, but they believe in God already, well, I don't have to give any arguments for God. They already believe in God, right? I'm going to give arguments from the New Testament documents and show Jesus who he said he was. But if somebody comes up to me and says, I don't believe in God, or says, I don't even believe in truth, then I'm going to start with truth, and then go to God, and then go to miracles, and then go to the New Testament. But if somebody agrees with truth and God and miracles, and they're just hung up on whether or not Jesus was who he said he was, then start there. It's just a method,
All right, cool, thank you.
All right, thanks, Matthew. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Eric again. And there you go, keep coming. You don't have to wait, just keep coming. Go ahead, Eric.
Okay, so what do you say to the person who has no belief in free will? Because purpose and things like that sort of, at some level, presume free will, that we're free to make choices.
Okay, well, first of all, I would ask, are you freely saying that?
No, I'm only saying this because a whole series of biochemical reactions are happening that make these words come out of my
Okay,
mouth.
well, how is it that these biochemical reactions are happening and you are saying precisely the right words to my question if this is all natural forces?
Because that's how the biochemistry of the brain works.
Okay, well, see, that's just a so what story, that just happens that way. But secondly, when somebody says something, it's not your job to refute what they say. It's that person's job to support what they say. So if someone says, I don't believe in free will, my first question is, what do you mean by free will? Because even someone who agrees with free will doesn't think their free will is unlimited. Like, I don't have the free will to jump 60 feet in the air, right? I'm limited by reality here. But I have the free will to try and jump 60 feet in the air. So I'd ask them, what do you mean by that? The second question is, how did you come to that conclusion? Because if he comes to the conclusion that there is no free will, but he didn't come to it freely, why should we believe it? In other words, this is an Achilles heel of atheism. They think we're molecular machines. But why do they think that we're molecular machines? What evidence do they have? They couldn't have evidence because every time they think something, it's not because they're rationally reasoning from the evidence to a rational conclusion. It's because the laws of physics are dictating they think that way.
Mm-hmm. I mean, central to that is sort of an atheistic view that, there's a certain amount of evidence, and the only reason that we don't have more evidence is because we haven't discovered it yet.
Well, what does that have to do with free will? I don't understand what...
Oh, just, that the reason I don't have free will is simply because, I have this molecular machine going to make me say these things.
But how would you know you had this molecular machine going is what I mean. I mean, how would you know that? I'm looking for a slide here. In other words, atheism makes it impossible for you to know that. Let me show you what I mean by this. This is Francis Crick, who looks a little creepy to me. Francis Crick, as you know, discovered the DNA molecule, okay? And he had the theory that you just stated, Eric, so let's go over it. Here's what he said. The astonishing hypothesis is that you, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. In other words, you are nothing but a molecular machine. You're just a moist robot. You may think you have free will, but you don't. Okay? Can anyone see the problem with this philosophy? You have to come up with the hypothesis. How did he come up with it? Freely? Or is he a molecular machine too? In fact, look at it this way. Imagine if Crick had written this in his book. Imagine if he had said, the astonishing hypothesis is that my scientific conclusions that I write in this book are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Would we have any reason to believe anything he says is true? No, this is self-defeating. It's self-defeating to say you don't have free will because you got to have the free will to say it. And if you don't have the free will to say it, then you're not really uttering a truth claim anyway. The very claim that you're uttering that you don't have free will is the result of physics. Well, physics don't tell you truth. Physics just do the same thing over and over again. So what they're doing is they're stealing from God while arguing he doesn't exist. This is why neuroscience will never prove there's no mind. You always hear all this, that, in neuroscience, we've discovered that when you think about certain things, an area of your brain lights up over here, or it lights over here, so it's just a correlation here. It's a one-to-one correspondence. Your mind and your brain are the same. They could never discover that because who is doing the experiments to discover these correlations? Human beings. And they have to assume they have free will and can rationally examine and interpret the evidence. If they don't have free will to rationally examine and interpret the evidence, why should they believe any of their conclusions? You see, the problem here is that atheists exempt themselves from their own theories. They say everybody's a molecular machine, except them. They're not molecular machines. Crick doesn't think he's a molecular machine, right? He thinks he has free will and he's reasoning rationally to his conclusions. In fact, Daniel Dennett, another atheist, says that consciousness is an illusion. One wonders if he was conscious when he wrote that. Okay? Notice, he doesn't think his consciousness is an illusion. He thinks he's reasoning rationally to a conclusion and that he has consciousness and he can tell what's going on here. So I just think it's a self-defeating position. It's like saying I can't speak a word in English. Does that make sense?
It makes great sense. The only thing I would add to that is that that would be more or less consistent with an atheistic view that there is no absolute truth, that everyone is making up their own truth.
Is it true that there's no absolute truth?
Right. Yeah.
The problem for atheists, and most atheists wouldn't agree with that, like Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris or Daniel Dennett or these guys that are out there, they're not relativists. They think science yields truth. They just don't realize that they can't do science without immaterial reality, like the laws of logic and morality and cause and effect and our ability to rationally understand the real world around us. These are all things that can't be explained if we're just molecular machines. There's a whole chapter in the Stealing from God book on this called the chapter on reason, so check that out. Yes, sir. What's your name?
My name is Josh.
Hey, Josh.
And my question was, do you think like the 7 days of creation were like a literal 7 days or like more figurative? Because I've heard Christians argue both sides.
Yeah.
And then also how like people that might try to point to like carbon dating, like how that would tie in.
Excellent question. Josh, I'm absolutely certain the universe is at least 54 years old. All right, let me throw my dad in there. It's 79 years old, at least. Actually, you're right that Christians disagree on this. Let's spend a minute on it because it's such a common question, because Christians will disagree. And they'll say, well, science shows an old universe. And they'll say light from the stars shows that the universe is 13.8 billion years old. But what are they assuming? The speed of light has not changed, okay? Is it a good assumption to say the speed of light hasn't changed? Yeah, probably. Why? Because if the speed of light has changed, all the other laws of physics would have to change with it. So it's probably a good assumption. If the assumption's good, then the universe at least appears to be 13.8 billion years old. What about salt in the ocean? It's often used to show the Earth is young. The problem is you're assuming a uniform deposition rate and the beginning amount of salt is 0. That's an assumption you can't prove. What about radioactive dating, which you brought up? That makes assumptions you can't prove as well. And radioactive dating is used to date things on the Earth. It's not used to date the Earth itself. Notice we actually have 3 questions in the question. We have how old's the universe, how old's the Earth, how old is life? Those are all 3 different questions, but we're just dealing with the universe now. Now, what I'm saying here is no matter what dating method you use, you're making assumptions you can't prove, okay? Now, does the Bible show that the universe is young, or does it teach the universe is young? Here's where Christians disagree. Let me ask you guys a question. What does the first verse of the Bible say? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, when did God create the heavens and the earth? In the beginning. Okay, when was the beginning? It doesn't say. You say, well, what about the days? The days don't begin to verse 3. This is verse 1. So my point here is that since the initial creation happened before day 1, the Bible doesn't say how old the universe is. It may be young, it may be old, but it doesn't make a definitive statement. In fact, John Lennox from Oxford University points this out in his book, 7 Days That Divide the World. If you want a nice book on this topic, you can get it. 7 Days That Divide the World, but we don't know how far back the initial creation was, even if all the days are 24 hours. Secondly, even if the days are pertinent to the age question, the word for day in Genesis 1 could mean longer periods of time. In fact, it does mean a longer period of time in Genesis 2. There are 4 usages of the word day in the first chapter and a half of Genesis. One usage is it could be 24 hours, obviously. It could also be 12 hours. Why? Because it says he called the day, or the light day, and the darkness night. That's 12 hours. Also, it could mean an unending period of time, or I should say an era of time. Like if I were to say, let's see, you guys are in redskin country. If I were to say that Joe Gibbs was a great coach in his day, you wouldn't think that Joe Gibbs was just a good coach for 24 hours, right? You would get the idea, okay, he had an era. Yes, exactly. And the 4th possible usage I'll get to in a minute. Notice also the 3rd day seems to require longer than 24 hours because you have the growth of vegetation, including fruit-bearing plants. Even if you put Miracle Grow on that stuff, it doesn't grow that fast. You say, well, maybe God sped it up, but now what are you doing? You're making an assumption you can't prove. Do you know he sped it up? Well, God created Adam and Eve fully grown. You're still making an assumption you can't prove. Does that mean that the plants were fully grown? How do you know? You're making assumptions. Also, the 6th day seems to require longer than 24 hours. You got the naming of the animals. You know, Adam began naming the animals late in the 6th day. You know how many animals were there when Adam started naming? He doesn't have enough time. In fact, Brad Stein, a Christian comedian, kind of has a bit on this, where he says, in the beginning of the day, Adam was real creative. He'd see an animal come by, he'd go, hippopotamus. He'd see another come by, rhinoceros, by the end of the day. It's a cow. ox. You know, he's just run out of gas. Come on. And then the seventh day seems to require longer because the seventh day hasn't ended yet. We're still in the seventh day. Do you realize that? According to Hebrews 4, we're in the seventh day right now. So if the seventh day is longer, maybe the other days are longer. We simply don't know. In fact, I think if you look at Genesis 1, you know what you have? You have an historical account told in a poetic way. You have the first 3 days are creation, last 3 days are filling. They all begin with the same phrase. They all begin with the same phrase. This is a poetic way of telling you history. But if I were to give you a poem of, say, the Civil War, you would get good history from it, but you wouldn't push every word to its wooden literal extent. You know this is a poem. I think the same thing is true in Genesis. You get the idea that God is the creator and the organizer of nature. But you don't press every single word to its wooden literal limit. And if you do that to the first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Heavens and the earth are created before the days ever begin. So the bottom line is there's no conflict between science and the Bible. There's only a conflict between some interpretations of the scientific and biblical data. The universe may be older, it may be young. Science and the Bible are not definitive. Why? Because you need to make assumptions you can't prove. Now, if you put a gun to my head and said, how old is the universe? I'm going to say 13.8 billion years old, because I think the best assumptions are that the speed of light hasn't changed. And the only scientific and biblical data that is definitive is that God created, not when. Don't make this a test for orthodoxy. If you're a Christian, particularly if you're a young earther, because I see the young earthers making this a test for orthodoxy. You're not even a Christian if you're not. No, come on, please. When you get to heaven, God isn't going to say, did you think it was old or young? No, he's not going to do that. He's going to say, what did you do with Jesus, right? Now you say, what about death before the fall? The Bible does not say death came to all creation before the fall or by the sin of Adam. It says death came to all men. That's what it says, Romans 5:12. And by the way, there was a fall before the fall. What was the fall before the fall? Yeah, Satan falls. We don't have a lot of data on that either. You know, we have to piece that together from oblique references. So, it may be old, it may be young. Just be sure that you have grace, because it's certainly not an issue of salvation to be talking about, how old the universe is. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Hi, Frank. I'm Jose. Thank you for
Jose.
being here.
Yes, sir.
I have a question, maybe not related with everything, but kind of related about everything. Maybe you've been hearing it a lot from different churches or pastors. So how do you answer to pastors and leaders that think the apologetic is not needed in the church at this time?
Well, I would ask them why they think that, right? Why do you think that's not the case? And secondly, it seems to be commanded in the Bible. It's not an option, right? He doesn't say that only some people have to have a reason. He doesn't say only some people love God with your mind. Only some people destroy arguments. Only some people defend the faith. No, he says all. No, I understand. Not everybody's going to be equally skilled at these things. But we should have some basic knowledge of why we believe what we believe. And if you think that the non-intellectual way is working for Christianity, I think you have your head in the sand. I mean, look what's going on in our culture. Our culture is disintegrating because the godly people are abandoning ship. We don't know why we believe what we believe. Why do 75% of young people walk away from the church once they go to college? One of the major reasons is they don't know why it's true, because we've never told them why it's true. So I think it's commanded in Scripture. And whenever people give me arguments against apologetics, I go, why are you giving me arguments? We ought not be giving arguments. Because that's what they're doing. See, they're trying to make an argument. You ought not give arguments. That appears to me to be self-defeating. Good question, Jose. Yes. How you doing? What's your name?
My name is Chantal.
Hi, Chantal.
I want to make sure I understand. How long do you think it took to create the heavens and the earth?
How long?
Yeah.
Well, God could have created it in an instant.
Okay, so here's my question. If he created the earth and the heavens the way you described it to us earlier, why would he need more than 24 hours to create
He doesn't.
the rest?
He does. Why does he need 24 seconds?
Because you say that the creation could have taken more than 7 days of 24 hours.
Well, the question is, how long ago did it take? Not the question, how long did it take him to create? He could have created it all in an instant, and it could have been 13.8 billion years ago, right? He doesn't need 24 hours to create anything. He could create everything in a millisecond, and it'd all be done. So he's God, right?
Yeah, okay.
So he could. The question is, how long ago did this take place? That's the question.
Okay, because from Josh's question, I understood how long did it take to create in a 7 day. Would it take only 7 days or more than 7 days to create the whole thing?
What I'm saying is, quite frequently, we try and see how old the universe is by looking at the book of Genesis and trying to work our back to when creation was.
Okay, so your answer was how long ago that happened after it was all finished?
It could be that. The question I'm trying to answer is, how old is the universe? That's the question that I was asked. And I don't know how old it is.
Oh,
what I'm
okay.
saying is, no matter how you interpret the Bible or science, you're making assumptions you can't prove. So it
Okay.
could be 13.8 billion years old. It could be several thousand years old. We don't know for sure. If I'm going to be pressed on it, I'm going to say the better evidence is that it's 13.8 billion years old due to the speed of light.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Brian.
Hey, Brian.
And I'm a fan, and I've been to your CIA training, and so.
Oh, yeah, I knew I recognized you. How you doing?
All
You know, we
right.
do it in California this year, Brian.
All right, that's a nice location.
Yeah, it is.
If anyone's interested, it's a great training. It's great to get trained.
We
on
take
how
you to
be an
Langley
apologist.
and we torture you. No, it's not that kind of CIA. It's Cross-Examine Instructor Academy.
The question I had was about the creation account. I don't know if you've done some studying on the mitochondrial Eve, and if so, if you have any comments about
Not
that.
a lot. No, I know of it, and you, Ross, has done some good work in that. Mitochondrial Eve talks about the DNA or the elements of DNA that are passed only through the mother, correct? But I don't know much about it, so I'm not the guy to ask. Why? What about it do you know about it?
No,
that-
I was just
Oh.
curious. There are some scientists, and a lot of Christians have jumped on this, but that believe basically that every single human being descends from one woman, and
Right.
they've named her mitochondrial Eve, and so I just find that to be very interesting.
The one that you would look to, and I'm not the expert in that, so my opinion doesn't matter, but Fuzrana, Fuzrana at Reasons to Believe, or reasons.org, probably has a good article on that.
Okay.
So check that out, Brian.
Thank you.
All right, good to see you. Mary Jo.
So this was excellent because I've always struggled with, how old the Earth is, universe. However, even my church, most of the people I talk to, most of the leadership claims it's within 5,000-6,000 years old.
Mm-hmm.
But this has me thinking. However, when it comes to the issue of dinosaurs, so the universe, I understand that it could have been 13 billion years ago when it was created. But however, when the flood happened, didn't that not destroy everything on Earth, including any animals that could have roamed at that point? So when they find these dinosaur artifacts and things like that, they couldn't have been back in the 13 billions of years ago
Well,
if they weren't created until...
Well, if in fact they were created long before men, if the universe is very old and they were already fossilized by the time the flood occurred, yeah, they could be millions of years old if in fact that's the true dating.
So, but according to the Bible, animals weren't created before the earth, right? I mean...
No, not before the earth, but before Noah.
Right.
Right? So the question is, how long before Noah were the dinosaurs created? Maybe days?
Oh, so you're
Yeah.
saying that portion, that day when the animals could have been...
Could have been a long period of time, too.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That's...
Yeah. All right. Thanks. I think Lennox's book is the best one on it, Mary Jo, if you want to get it. 7 Days Divide the World. Yes, ma'am. What's your name?
Hello, my name is Colleen.
Hey,
I don't
Colleen.
have a question, but I found in Exodus, since we were talking about the parting of the Red Sea, I wanted to read it.
Yeah, go ahead.
So it's in Exodus 14, and starting in verse 15, it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots and horsemen.'" And then starting in verse 26, it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen.' Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. None of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians laying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant." So I just wanted to share that because
Yeah, that's what Kevin was saying, that account has the
the
Sisa
walls, the
Mill
water.
look to it. Now, if Deuteronomy has a different way of describing it, that's fine. You know, Deuteronomy is a summary of the first 4 books of the Old Testament, really. Deuteronomy summarizes and repeats much of what's in the previous book, so you might have an economy of the account there, rather than, it's not going to describe it with that kind of detail in the same way, because it's already there in Exodus. It's just repeating and summarizing what's already occurred.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Matthew.
So this question kind of comes as more of a question regarding like summarizing everything that you've talked about today. It's something you've referenced a couple times, and I know it's a concern of a lot of Christians is the whole that we're in the middle of a cultural war, and that society is going to hell in a handbasket, and that things are just constantly going downhill, and we look around and we see this, that, or the other happening, and people choosing to accept standards that aren't standards we personally agree with or standards that we think are right. People deny morality, things like that, and I look and say, I believe this is wrong, and someone else says, well, I think it's totally right, and things like that. And you talked about it at the beginning about how we can't just say, well, what's true for you isn't true for me, or vice versa. But then I'm also reminded of the fact that the large majority of the commands, standards set forth in the Bible are addressed specifically to us as Christians. When you read Paul's epistles, they're written to the churches in the various cities, and he's imparting God's words to the believers. And like you mentioned, we have to be careful about making sure that we understand the context of Scripture and who those instructions are being addressed to. And so oftentimes, a lot of the commands in the Bible are addressed to Christians and not addressed to non-believers. So do you think that, I guess one could posit and suggest that the moral standards for Christians are not necessarily applicable to non-believers because non-believers don't recognize Christ as an authority? So my question is, as Christians, do we have a responsibility to try to enforce those standards upon other people, or is that something that we rather ought to leave to God and rather focus more on our own actions and not on trying to control the actions of those who don't even hold Christ as the ultimate lawgiver?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you have to evaluate those issues on a case-by-case basis, right? Like, for example, blasphemy laws. They used to have them in the United States because most people were Christians. We don't have them anymore. In fact, do you know that the government, the Constitution of Maryland requires you to be a Christian to be a public servant? Did you know that? I'm pretty sure it's just about every state. If you look at their state constitutions, they require, if not full-blown Christianity, at least belief in God. Now, why? Because that's where we were 200 years ago. My contention is if you want to change that, you have to have a constitutional amendment. You don't just decide it doesn't apply anymore. But no, there are many things that a Christian might not do that a that we might permit otherwise. Drunkenness, for example. Christians aren't supposed to be drunk, but does that mean we're going to outlaw drunkenness? No, we might outlaw the consequences of drunkenness, like driving a car while you're drunk, because that's going to hurt others. But we're not going to say if somebody gets drunk, we're going to throw them in jail. Okay? Premarital sex. Christians aren't supposed to be involved in that. Really? Did you guys ever hear that? Gee, you wouldn't think so. But no, we're not. We're supposed to have sex within marriage. And we don't want to make premarital sex outlawed for all people. So yeah, there are many things that a Christian standard might be here and a non-Christian standard might be here, but the issues we're talking about are not here or here. The issues we're talking about are basic to all humanity, like life. Are we supposed to allow people to kill one another, innocent people, for no reason in abortion? Like marriage. Marriage, the only way to have a stable society, regardless of whether you believe in God or not, is to bring men and women together in a monogamous lifetime relationship to perpetuate and stabilize society through the upbringing of children. If you equate any other relationship to that, what you're basically saying is that marriage has nothing to do with children. And if marriage has nothing to do with children, then why is the government even in it? Why does the government care if John loves Mary or Steve loves Bill? It's not a romantic relationship the government's concerned about. The government's concerned about what happens to society by promoting certain relationships. There's only three things a government can do with any relationship or any behavior. It can prohibit a behavior, it can permit a behavior, or it can promote a behavior. There's a difference between permitting homosexual relationships and promoting them by saying they're just like heterosexual relationships that we call marriage. No, they're not. They can't be the same. There are different genders here that bring forth different results. So I think these are basic to society, and Christians have every right to be engaged in the political process as anybody else. And in fact, let me just show you one little overhead here, if I can find it. When people say we ought not be involved in politics as Christians, I just show them one picture. And this is the picture. Does anyone know what this is? That's the Korean Peninsula. Now, why is there a difference between South and North Korea? Frank, because these people have electricity and these people don't. Yeah, but why does the South have electricity and the North doesn't? And look, South Korea is one of the more Christianized countries in the world. It has freedom, it has the gospel, it has productivity. North Korea, on the other hand, is a concentration camp. And there's one reason, major reason for the difference between South and North Korea. You know what the difference is? The reason is politics. The South has freedom, the North does not. And if you think the gospel's important as I do, then you better be interested in politics. Why? Because politics affects your ability to preach the gospel. If you don't think so, try and do what we're doing here today in North Korea. See how far you get. Go to some of the countries I've been to, Iran, Saudi Arabia, China. We can't do what we're doing in this room right now in those countries, not legally. In fact, in China yesterday, I just read a story where a pastor's wife stood in front of a bulldozer because the government wanted to tear down the church, and they buried her alive. So if you think that preaching the gospel is important and living as a Christian is important, you better think politics are important, because I'm telling you, I've had a friend of mine, very prominent pastor, a friend of mine said, after the same-sex marriage thing got passed, I said, pretty soon they're going to be forcing pastors to do this. He goes, that'll never happen. I said, you don't understand history. One day, literally, unless something changes, they're going to come to this church right here and shut those doors. And they're going to say, you guys are hate-filled bigots. There's no way you're going to go on anymore. They'll confiscate this property and turn it into a shrine of something else. Because that's history.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So you brought up, It's a startling picture right there of North and South Korea. But the immediate thing that came to my mind is China. China has one of what could be argued one of the most vibrant, strongest Christian communities in the world. Some of the strongest Christians that, despite the oppression and political oppression of the state of China, Christianity has blossomed, has grown.
But why is that an argument? But why?
Well, it's slowly taking over the country and affecting change. So my question is, do you think that one method of achieving societal and cultural change could be more effective than another? That while, yes, changing a government can be great, but you look at China and it has strong Christians because they've had to work through oppression versus the United States where we're free.
The Chinese are actually controlling this microphone right now. And you no longer have the freedom to speak. Sorry about that, Matthew. You were getting a little bit too close to the truth. And that's it. You're done. You're toast. All right. Since he plays the drums here, he knows how to work this stuff. All right, go ahead. Yeah. No, it's not the only way. It's not an either or, it's a both and. In other words, we should be working to change hearts and minds, but we also ought to be working to change the government. It's not either or. We can do both. But just because the church often flourishes under persecution doesn't mean that we don't fight evil. Because if we don't fight evil, we're complicit with it. Yeah, God can get his will done through evil, but that doesn't mean we acquiesce to evil. I mean, when Hitler charged across Europe, should we have just said, it's okay, turn the other cheek? No, Jesus wasn't talking about militaries turning the other cheek. No, not at all. So there are times when you have to stand and fight. And even Jesus didn't tell the soldiers to get out of the military. What did he say? He said, treat everybody fairly. Or it may have been John the Baptist that said this, right? So the point here is that we're supposed to do both. Just because God can bring good through evil doesn't mean we allow evil to continue. We fight evil and we leave the results to God. And by the way, this is true in the culture wars. You may think, oh, the culture war's over, we've lost. It doesn't matter if we've lost. It doesn't matter if we're always going to lose. It's not your job to win. It's your job to be faithful. You may not win another political battle in your life. That doesn't matter. You just keep doing what's right. You leave the results to God.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.